You
You
don't
need to
tell a
stop this
billionaire
right
where he
now.
can and cannot drive. The head of security
Step
snapped,
away.
his voice sharp
Not
enough to
until we
silence
finish
the
this.
marble lobby around them. Evelyn Carter didn't answer immediately. She simply stood there beside her silver coffee cart, fingers wrapped tightly around a ceramic pot that had suddenly become too hot to hold. Outside the 20-foot glass windows of the Hawthorne Grand Hotel, Manhattan looked washed in cold January light. Gray skies, wet pavement, steam rising from the streets like the city itself was exhausted. "Sir," Evelyn said quietly, "then at least don't let him take the tunnel route." A few businessmen nearby turned their heads. Someone chuckled under their breath. The security chief stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You hearing yourself right now?" Evelyn's eyes moved past him toward the valet corridor, toward the chauffeur in the black wool coat speaking softly into an earpiece near the revolving doors. Russian, fast, calm, professional, the kind of calm that frightened her most. "Once we cross the tunnel, it's finished." The words had slipped through the noise of clinking dishes and elevator bells
More
less than
coffee, sir?
60 seconds earlier, but they hit her
Not
like
just
ice
yet.
water down her spine. Because
Very
Evelyn
good.
understood every syllable. She wished she didn't. "Ma'am?" The security chief said impatiently. "You got some kind of problem?" Evelyn forced herself to blink. No, but that was a lie. A dangerous one. Upstairs, somewhere above the hotel's crystal chandeliers and polished brass railings, Richard Hale was finishing a breakfast meeting worth more money than Evelyn would see in 3 lifetimes. CEO, billionaire, political donor, the kind of man whose face appeared on financial channels before sunrise. She had seen him before, always surrounded by expensive silence. Tailored coats, men with discreet earpieces, women carrying tablets and schedules. People moved around Richard Hale carefully, like planets around something heavy enough to pull everything inward. But this morning felt different. The chauffeur kept checking his watch. One bodyguard looked nervous. Another kept touching the inside of his jacket every 30 seconds. Tiny things, almost invisible. Evelyn noticed because invisible people always notice more than everyone else. She adjusted the sleeve of her cream blouse and lowered her eyes as Richard Hale finally entered the lobby restaurant. Tall, 63 maybe, silver hair combed neatly back, black leather gloves still on despite the warmth inside. Conversations softened immediately around him. Even the hotel manager straightened his tie when Richard walked past. But the billionaire never looked at anyone directly. Not the hostess, not the pianist near the bar, not Evelyn. He looked like a man carrying 10 different wars inside his head. Evelyn poured coffee into a cup at table 7 and heard the chauffeur speak again. No witnesses after the bridge. This time her hand trembled, just slightly. Coffee spilled over the rim onto the white saucer. And suddenly, she knew this wasn't paranoia anymore. Evelyn set the trembling cup onto the serving tray before anyone noticed the spill. Around her, the restaurant continued moving with polished perfection. Silverware clinking softly, muted jazz floating through hidden speakers, waiters crossing the marble floor in synchronized silence. But inside her chest, something old had awakened. Something she had
Copy
spent
that.
years
Package
trying to
is
bury.
secure.
The
He's
chauffeur
here.
stood
I'm sure
near
he
the
knows.
revolving doors
Depart now.
now,
Protocol
one
Delta.
gloved hand resting calmly behind his back while snow drifted sideways outside the glass. Mid-40s maybe. Broad shoulders. Short blonde hair cut almost military close. He did not look nervous anymore. That frightened her even more. Nervous people made mistakes. Calm people committed to plans. "Evelyn." Her manager's voice snapped sharply behind her. "Table 12 is waiting on their check." She turned too quickly. "Sorry. You feeling all right?" he asked, lowering his voice. "You look pale. Just tired." Another lie. She grabbed the black leather check folder and crossed the dining room. But her eyes kept drifting toward Richard Hale. The billionaire sat alone now at the long corner table after his executives disappeared toward the elevators upstairs. He was reading something on a tablet while absently stirring untouched coffee. Even from 20 feet away, he looked exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. Like a man who had stopped expecting honesty from the world a very long time ago. Evelyn recognized that
Do you
look
see that?
because she wore
It's
it too.
oil.
As she
Yeah, it's
passed
definitely
behind
leaking.
him, she
Call
heard
it in.
another
Oh
voice
my
near the valet
God.
station.
We've confirmed the
Russian
leak.
again.
Initiate
Lower this
lockdown.
time. Faster. Timing changed. Leave in 7 minutes. Her stomach tightened instantly. 7 minutes. The chauffeur answered without emotion. Understood. Evelyn kept walking without turning her head. Years ago, during another lifetime she rarely spoke about, she learned that panic made people visible. Calm kept you alive. She reached table 12 and placed the check beside an older couple arguing quietly over dessert. But she could not hear them anymore. Her mind was somewhere else, replaying old memories she hated. Rain against embassy windows in Prague. Men speaking Russian in dark hallways. A translator disappearing after overhearing the wrong conversation. Evelyn blinked hard and forced herself back into the present. No, this was Manhattan. Not Europe. Not intelligence work. Not that life anymore. She was a waitress now. Invisible. Safe. But then Richard Hale stood from his chair. Instantly, two bodyguards moved toward him. The chauffeur stepped outside beneath the covered hotel entrance and opened the rear passenger door of the black Mercedes waiting curbside. Evelyn noticed another detail then. Tiny. Almost absurdly small. Fresh oil beneath the rear tire. A thin dark line slowly spreading across wet concrete. Her pulse skipped. She looked up sharply toward the driver. He caught her staring for half a second and smiled. Not warmly. Not threateningly either. Worse. Like someone already certain the ending had been decided. Evelyn felt cold all over. Richard Hale buttoned his charcoal coat and began walking toward the exit while the security team cleared a path through the lobby. Nobody noticed the oil. Nobody noticed the driver's smile. Nobody except the invisible waitress standing beside the coffee station, trying to decide whether she was about to ruin a billionaire's morning or save his life. Evelyn's heartbeat slowed instead of speeding up. That was the first sign she was truly afraid. Years ago, a man in Warsaw had once told her that panic belonged to amateurs. Real danger made the world quieter, slower, sharper. And right now, every sound inside the Hawthorne Grand Hotel suddenly felt painfully clear. The soft squeak of polished shoes across marble. Ice shifting inside whiskey glasses at the bar. The distant hum of traffic beyond the revolving doors. Richard Hale moved steadily through the lobby surrounded by security, his posture straight despite the exhaustion carved into his face. One assistant hurried beside him holding a tablet and reading the morning schedule under her breath. Conference call at 9:30. Midtown Development meeting at 11. Lunch with the mayor at 1. Richard barely nodded. He looked like a man who had not slept properly in years. Evelyn stepped away from the coffee station before she could lose her nerve. Mr. Hale. Nobody heard her the first time. She swallowed hard. Mr. Hale. One bodyguard immediately blocked her path. Tall. Bald. Navy suit stretched across his shoulders. Back up, ma'am. I need 30 seconds. Not happening. Richard continued walking toward the entrance without looking at her. Evelyn glanced toward the chauffeur again. The man was calm. Too calm. Snowflakes drifted onto his black coat while he held the rear car door open with mechanical patience.
You're
Waiting.
welcome.
Please, Evelyn said, lowering her voice. Do not let him take the Mercedes. That got Richard's attention. Barely. He slowed near the entrance and turned just enough to study her over one shoulder. Cold gray eyes. Careful eyes. The kind that measured threats for a living. Excuse me, he asked quietly. Evelyn felt every person in the lobby suddenly listening. Sir, something is wrong with the car. The bald bodyguard let out a short laugh. Based on what? Your waitress intuition. A few people nearby smiled awkwardly. Richard Hale did not. He simply stared at Evelyn as if deciding whether she was unstable or dangerous. You work here, he asked. Yes. And suddenly you are a mechanic? No, her throat tightened. She could not explain without explaining too much. I just think. You should wait 10 minutes before leaving. Why? The single word hit harder than shouting. Because she had no proof. Only fragments. Russian words. Oil beneath a tire. A smile that did not belong. Evelyn glanced briefly toward the chauffeur again. His expression had not changed, but his hand slowly lowered into his coat pocket. Tiny movement. Easy to miss. Richard noticed her glance. For the first time, suspicion flickered across his face. Ethan, he said softly to the bald guard. Check the vehicle. The guard sighed in irritation, but motioned toward another security agent outside. The chauffeur immediately stepped forward. Sir, we are already late. His accent was faint now. Controlled. American enough to disappear in conversation unless someone knew what to listen for. Evelyn's stomach dropped. He was adapting. Richard looked between them carefully. Snow blew through the opening doors behind him, cold air rushing across the warm lobby floor. Nobody moved for 3 long seconds. Then suddenly the chauffeur smiled again. "Mr. Hale," he said calmly, "you really trust a waitress over your own driver?" The question hung in the lobby like smoke. Richard Hale did not answer immediately. Snow spiraled outside the glass entrance while hotel guests slowed their footsteps just enough to watch without appearing obvious. Evelyn could feel every eye in the room pressing against her skin. The chauffeur remained perfectly still beside the Mercedes, one hand resting inside his coat pocket, the other lightly gripping the open rear door. Calm, patient, waiting for Richard to make the wrong choice. "Sir," the bald bodyguard muttered quietly, "this is ridiculous." Richard ignored him. His gaze stayed fixed on Evelyn. Not warm, not trusting, calculating. "What is your name?" he asked. "Evelyn Carter." "How exactly did you conclude my driver is a threat, Miss Carter?" She opened her mouth, then stopped, because the real answer sounded insane. "I recognized operational language patterns from my years translating military intelligence briefings in Eastern Europe. Instead," she said softly, "I heard enough to know you should not get into that car." The chauffeur laughed once, under his breath. "You see? Nothing concrete." Richard's expression hardened slightly. "Ethan, finish checking the vehicle." The bald guard gave a reluctant nod and stepped outside with another security agent. The chauffeur finally removed his hand from his pocket. Empty. But Evelyn noticed disappointment flash across his face for less than a second. Tiny. Dangerous. Richard noticed it too. The billionaire slowly turned toward his driver. "You seem nervous this morning, Victor." "Not nervous, sir. Concerned." Victor adjusted his gloves smoothly. "You are already late for Midtown." Richard studied him without blinking. "And yet you are arguing with security procedures." Silence. Cold air drifted through the open doors again. Somewhere deeper in the hotel, an elevator bell chimed softly. Evelyn realized her hands were shaking now. She tucked them behind the serving tray before anyone noticed. Ethan crouched beside the Mercedes, inspecting underneath with visible annoyance. "Looks clean," he called back. Victor smiled faintly. "Of course it does." Richard exhaled slowly through his nose. Decision time. Evelyn could almost feel it happening behind his eyes. Trust routine or trust instinct. Suddenly Ethan paused beside the rear tire.
"You need to
Hold
stop
on.
this right now."
Everyone froze. He leaned lower toward the pavement, touching something near the wheel
Not
well.
until we finish
Oil
this.
coated his fingertips. "That was not there earlier," Ethan muttered. Victor's face changed instantly. Not panic. Worse. Calculation. In one smooth movement, he stepped backward away from the vehicle. Richard's security team reacted immediately, forming a barrier around the billionaire as tension snapped through the lobby like a wire pulled too tight. Hotel guests backed away in confusion. Evelyn's pulse hammered so loudly she could barely hear anything else. Victor raised both hands calmly. "You are overreacting." But nobody believed him anymore. Richard stared at the dark stains spreading beneath the Mercedes, then slowly looked back at Evelyn. For the first time since entering the hotel, the billionaire truly saw her. Not as staff, not as background, as the one person in the entire building who noticed what everyone else missed. And somehow, that frightened him more than the oil beneath the car. The lobby erupted into controlled chaos without anyone actually raising their voice. That was the strange thing about
coffee,
wealthy
sir?
places. Panic arrived quietly.
Not just yet.
Security agents moved fast
Very
around
good.
Richard Hale, forming a tight wall between him and the Mercedes while hotel guests pretended not to stare. A woman near the piano lowered her champagne glass with trembling fingers. Someone whispered, "Call the police." Victor remained near the curb beneath the falling snow, hands visible now, expression unreadable. "This is becoming embarrassing," he said calmly. "A little oil leak and suddenly everyone thinks I am a criminal." Ethan ignored him. The bald security chief crouched lower beside the rear wheel, shining a flashlight underneath the vehicle. His jaw tightened immediately. "Sir," he stood slowly. "You need to step back inside." Richard did not move at first. His gray eyes stayed fixed on the car, as if trying to calculate how close danger had truly come. Then he looked toward Evelyn again. She wished he would stop doing that. Because every time his attention landed on her, she felt herself becoming visible in a world where invisible people survived longer. "Ms. Carter," Richard said quietly, "come with us." Her breath caught. "What? Now?" Ethan motioned sharply toward the private elevator corridor. "Move." Evelyn hesitated only a second before following them across the marble floor. She could feel confused eyes tracking her from every corner of the restaurant. 10 minutes ago, she had been refilling coffee cups. Now armed security escorted her through a restricted hallway beside one of the most powerful men in New York. The elevator doors closed behind them with a soft metallic sound. Silence settled instantly inside the mirrored walls. Richard removed one black leather glove finger by finger, watching Evelyn carefully. Up close, he looked older than he had downstairs. Deep lines near the eyes. Fatigue hidden beneath expensive grooming. Start talking, Ethan demanded. How did you know? Evelyn folded her arms tightly against herself. I heard him speaking Russian. Ethan frowned. You speak Russian? Enough. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. Enough for what? She looked down briefly. Enough to know he was not discussing traffic conditions. The elevator climbed smoothly. 22nd floor. 23rd. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Richard asked the question she had been dreading. Who are you really?
He's here.
Evelyn
Sure he
almost
knows.
laughed at that, because she had spent 7 years trying to become nobody. I am a waitress, she answered softly. Ethan muttered under his breath. That is not an answer. The elevator opened into a private executive floor lined with dark wood walls and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. Snow drifted between skyscrapers outside like ash floating through the sky. Security agents immediately secured the hallway while Richard walked slowly toward his office. Then suddenly, every phone in the corridor vibrated at once. Ethan checked his device first. The color drained from his face. Sir, Richard turned sharply. Ethan swallowed hard before speaking. There was an incident in the Midtown tunnel. The hallway went completely still. What kind of incident? Richard asked. Ethan looked briefly toward Evelyn before answering. A vehicle fire. Exactly along your scheduled route. Nobody breathed for a moment. Outside the windows, New York kept moving beneath the snow like nothing had happened at all. But inside that silent executive hallway, Richard Hale finally understood something terrifying. The waitress had not overreacted. She had been right. Richard Hale walked into his office without saying another word. The massive glass doors closed behind him softly, sealing out the tension spreading through the executive floor. Evelyn remained near the entrance beside Ethan while agents moved quickly through the hallway, speaking into earpieces and checking security feeds. Snow continued drifting past the floor-to-ceiling windows beyond Manhattan's skyline, but the calm beauty outside felt unreal now, like the city belonged to someone else. Ethan lowered his phone slowly. The tunnel fire started 3 minutes after your scheduled arrival window, he said quietly toward Richard. Investigators think it involved a mechanical ignition device. Richard loosened his tie for the first time all morning. Small gesture, but Evelyn noticed it immediately. Powerful men only touched their armor when they realized it had failed them. He turned toward her again. Sit down, Miss Carter. She remained standing. I am fine. That was not a request. His voice stayed calm, but exhaustion had crept into it now.
I needed you to know
Heavy.
everything.
Evelyn finally sat near
I
the edge of a
understand.
leather chair that
We'll get
probably
through
cost
this.
more than her monthly rent. The office smelled faintly of cedarwood and coffee. Dark shelves lined the walls beside framed photographs of political leaders, charity galas, and business summits. But there were almost no family pictures. That detail made her strangely sad. Richard walked toward the windows overlooking Central Park, buried beneath winter haze. You said you understood Russian. Yes. Where did you learn? Evelyn hesitated. Ethan folded his arms impatiently. We do not have time for half answers. She stared down at her hands. The silver wedding ring she still wore caught the pale morning light. My husband worked overseas, she said carefully. I translated for private contractors sometimes. Military? Ethan asked immediately. Evelyn gave the smallest nod. Silence followed. Richard remained facing the windows. And now you serve coffee in a hotel restaurant. Life changes. The billionaire let out a humorless laugh under his breath. That it does. One security agent entered quickly carrying a tablet.
You
Sir,
saved them all.
Victor disappeared before local police arrived. Ethan cursed quietly. We are
survived
reviewing
together.
airport surveillance now. Richard accepted the tablet without reacting outwardly, but Evelyn noticed his jaw tighten slightly. Someone had penetrated his inner circle. Someone close enough to drive him every morning. That kind of betrayal changed people. Richard finally turned around again. Why warn me? The question surprised her. What? Most people would stay silent. especially in New York. His gray eyes studied her carefully. You risked your job. Possibly more than that. Evelyn looked toward the snowy skyline outside. Because I knew what those words meant. Richard stepped closer slowly. No, that is not the reason. She met his gaze at last. Calm met calm. Then maybe because nobody warned my husband. The room became completely still. Ethan stopped typing. Even the security agents near the doorway looked up. Evelyn immediately regretted saying it aloud. 7 years of silence. And the truth slipped out in one exhausted sentence. Richard's expression changed subtly. Not pity. Something quieter. Recognition, maybe.
You saved my life.
What happened to him,
Thank
he
you so
asked.
much.
Evelyn swallowed hard. He trusted the wrong
You're
people
welcome.
overseas. Richard held her gaze for several long seconds. Then softly, almost to himself, he said, "So did I." The office remained silent long after Evelyn's words faded away. Outside the windows, snow continued falling across Manhattan in soft white sheets, muting the city beneath a cold gray sky. But inside Richard Hale's executive suite, something heavier than snow had settled into the room. Understanding. Richard walked slowly back toward his desk, removing the second leather glove with deliberate care. He looked different now. Smaller somehow. Not weaker. Just human. Ethan broke the silence first. "Sir, local authorities are requesting your statement." Richard barely nodded. Later, his attention returned to Evelyn. "Your husband worked security?" "Logistics support," she answered quietly. "Unofficial translation work, too." "And he died because someone compromised his team?" Evelyn looked down at the wedding ring she still could not bring herself to remove. "He died because he trusted people who smiled too easily." Richard absorbed that without speaking. Then his office phone rang sharply across the room, making everyone tense for a split second. Ethan answered immediately while another agent moved toward the windows. Evelyn noticed it then, how every person around Richard now watched shadows differently. One betrayal had poisoned the entire atmosphere. Ethan listened silently into the phone before lowering it slowly. "Sir, there is more." Richard's expression hardened again. "Go ahead." Forensics found a second vehicle registered under Victor's credentials parked 3 blocks from the tunnel entrance. Evelyn's stomach tightened instantly. Backup plan. Richard understood immediately too. His eyes narrowed toward the skyline. Meaning? Ethan hesitated. Meaning if the Mercedes failed, they likely intended to redirect your route. The office went cold despite the heat humming softly through hidden vents. Richard sat down heavily behind his desk for the first time since returning upstairs. 50 years of business warfare had trained him to anticipate attacks from competitors, politicians, even business partners. But betrayal inside his own security team, that was different. Personal. Evelyn watched him carefully. The billionaire no longer looked untouchable. He looked tired. Deeply tired. Like a man realizing money could buy protection, but not certainty. "Who besides your security team knew your route this morning?" she asked softly. Ethan looked surprised she spoke at all. Richard answered anyway. "Too many people." Evelyn nodded slowly. "That is usually how it starts." Ethan studied her now with less suspicion than before. "You sound experienced." She almost smiled. "I sound old." Richard leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on her. "No, you sound like someone who survived." The words landed harder than he intended. Evelyn looked away toward the snowy windows. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Richard stood again and crossed slowly toward a small wooden cabinet near the bookshelves. He poured water into 2 crystal glasses before offering one to her. "You are shaking," he said quietly. Evelyn accepted the glass carefully. Their fingers almost touched. Warm office lighting reflected softly against the crystal between them. "Delayed reaction," she admitted. Richard gave the faintest nod. "I know the feeling." Somewhere below them, sirens echoed faintly through Manhattan traffic. Distant. Cold. The city continued moving as if nothing had happened. But inside that office, 2 strangers sat facing each other across polished wood and falling snow, both realizing the same thing at the exact same moment. Survival changed people. And sometimes, the people changed by it recognized each other immediately. An hour later, the storm over Manhattan had thickened into heavy gray snowfall that blurred the skyline beyond Richard Hale's office windows. News helicopters drifted faintly above the city like distant insects while television screens mounted along the executive hallway quietly replayed footage from the Midtown Tunnel. Traffic halted. Emergency lights flashing against white snow. Commentators speaking in calm, polished voices about a vehicle-related incident. Nobody publicly mentioned Richard Hale's name. Yet, inside the office, tension settled into something quieter now, more dangerous than panic. Realization. Ethan stood near the conference table reviewing security reports while agents moved in and out of the room, carrying phones, tablets, and sealed folders. Every few minutes another piece of bad news arrived. Compromised schedules. Missing surveillance footage. A second employee suddenly unreachable. Richard listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. Evelyn remained near the windows holding the untouched glass of water he had given her earlier. Her pulse had finally slowed, but exhaustion was beginning to creep into her bones. She had worked the breakfast shift since 5:30 that morning. Now it felt like 3 different lifetimes had passed since pouring coffee downstairs. Richard noticed the fatigue before she spoke a word. "You should go home," he said quietly. Evelyn looked over at him. "And if whoever planned this thinks I talked?" Ethan immediately glanced up from the conference table. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. He had not considered that. Evelyn continued softly. "People willing to infiltrate your security team are not careless."
Not just
Silence
yet.
answered her, because she was right.
Very good.
Richard stepped toward the windows beside her, both of them staring down at snow-covered Fifth Avenue far below. Black umbrellas moved like shadows through the streets. "You think they know you understood the conversation," he said. "I think Victor realized it the moment I warned you." Richard nodded once. Slow. Thoughtful. "Then you are staying here until we know more." Evelyn almost protested automatically, but stopped herself. For the first time in years, someone had said the word "stay here" without sounding controlling or selfish. Just practical. Human. Ethan's phone buzzed sharply again. He checked the message and frowned. "Sir, local investigators found something inside Victor's apartment." Richard turned. "What?" "Maps." Ethan looked toward Evelyn briefly before continuing. "Routes. Schedules. Security rotations." His voice lowered. "And photographs." The office seemed to darken around them. "Photographs of who?" Richard asked quietly. Ethan swallowed once. "You, your staff, and several taken this morning inside the restaurant." Evelyn's fingers tightened around the water glass. Richard noticed immediately, including her. Ethan gave a grim nod. A strange feeling moved across Richard Hale's face then. Not fear for himself. Fear for someone else. The realization appeared to unsettle him almost as much as the attack itself. Evelyn looked back toward the snowy skyline before speaking. "This is exactly why I stayed invisible after my husband died." Richard studied her profile carefully. Warm office light softened the tired lines around her eyes. She did not look like a woman seeking attention or heroism. She looked like someone who understood consequences too well. "Invisible people," Richard said quietly, "usually save the lives nobody else can." Evelyn let out the faintest breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "And powerful men usually notice too late." Richard looked down briefly before answering. Not this time. By late afternoon, the snowstorm over Manhattan had finally begun to weaken. Pale winter sunlight pushed softly through the clouds, casting silver reflections across the glass towers surrounding Richard Hale's office. Down below, traffic slowly returned to
Copy
normal.
that. Package is
Horns
secure.
echoed faintly
here.
through
I'm
wet
sure he
streets.
Depart
People
now.
rushed through
Protocol
crosswalks
Delta.
carrying coffee cups and umbrellas, unaware that only hours earlier, one quiet decision inside a hotel lobby had changed everything. Evelyn stood near the executive floor elevator, holding her coat in one hand, preparing to leave for the first time since sunrise. She looked exhausted now, the kind of exhaustion that reached deeper than lack of sleep. Ethan had arranged private transportation and temporary security for her, though she clearly hated accepting either one. "This will only be for a few days," he explained carefully, "until we know more." Evelyn gave a small nod, but said nothing. She had spent years rebuilding a life small enough to stay unnoticed. Now that life felt fragile again. The elevator doors opened softly behind her. Richard Hale stepped out alone. No assistants. No security surrounding him this time. Just the billionaire in a dark charcoal coat carrying something folded beneath one arm. Ethan immediately straightened. "Sir, your 4 o'clock conference call can wait." Richard's
see that?
eyes remained
It's
on
oil.
Evelyn.
Yeah,
The
it's
hallway
definitely
felt
leaking.
quiet as he
Call
walked
it in.
toward her
Oh my
slowly.
God.
Warm
We've confirmed
sunset
the leak.
light reflected
Initiate
against the
lockdown.
marble floor beneath them. "You are leaving," he said. "I was planning to." Richard handed her a small cream-colored envelope. Thick paper. No company logo. No business card attached. Evelyn frowned slightly. What is this? A thank you. She looked up immediately. I did not do this for money. I know. His answer came without hesitation. That is precisely why you deserve it. Evelyn hesitated before opening the envelope carefully. Inside was not a check, not a contract, just a handwritten note in dark blue ink. She read it silently while the city glowed gold outside the windows. For 30 years, I believe power came from controlling every room I entered. Today, a waitress reminded me that real power is noticing what everyone else ignores. Thank you for seeing danger when the rest of us only saw routine. Evelyn stared at the note for several seconds without speaking. Something fragile moved behind her tired eyes then. Not pride, not relief, something quieter. Richard noticed.
I needed you to know
You kept your
everything.
husband's ring, he said gently.
I understand.
Evelyn glanced down
We'll
at the
get through
silver
this.
band on her finger. Some things do not stop mattering just because time passes. Richard gave the smallest nod. I understand that better than I used to. Silence settled comfortably between them this time. No fear inside it anymore. Just recognition. Two survivors standing in the fading light of a long winter day. Finally, Evelyn slipped the note carefully into her coat pocket. Mr. Hale? Yes. Next time, listen the first time someone invisible speaks. For the first time all day, Richard smiled. Small. Real. Human. I will. The elevator doors closed slowly between them as Evelyn descended toward the crowded streets below, back to a world where most people would never know what she had prevented that morning. But somewhere above Manhattan, a billionaire stood silently beside the windows watching the snow melt from the city, understanding that sometimes the quietest people carry the loudest courage. And maybe that is why we should never underestimate the strangers we barely notice. If this story moved you, share your thoughts
You
below
saved them all.
and tell us, have you ever met someone quiet who changed everything without anyone
We
realizing it
survived
at
together.
first?